In this video, we're going to look at a variable costing example, and I'll walk us through the differences between variable costing and absorption costing in terms of how the cost of goods sold is calculated and the impact on income. And then we'll look at the income statements themselves and see how they present a little bit differently. Toward that end, we're going to look at 3 years of data. This is primarily so that we can see different changes of inventory and how those changes affect the differences between variable and absorption, because you will remember from the introductory video that in each differences between variable costing income and absorption costing income are directly tied to changes in inventory. So in terms of production, we're going to assume in year one that we had 0 beginning inventory. During the year, we produced 10,000 units. We sold all 10,000, meaning we had ending inventory at year one of 0, a change in inventory of 0. Okay, we started with nothing, we ended with nothing, no change. Year two, we'll start with what we had at the end of year one, which was nothing. We produced 10,000 units. We sold only 10. So we have ending inventory at year two of 2,000 units, an increase of 2,000. Year three, we'll start year three with what we ended year two with, the 2,000 units. We will assume that we produced only 8,000 units, but yet we sold 10,000, thereby resulting in 0 inventory at the end of the year, a decrease in inventory of 2,000. Now, notice, this will come out when we look at the different statements. Notice, every year we sold the same amount of units, 10,000 per year. What changed each year were the number of units that we produced. The other thing to notice is that for the 3-year cumulative period, we produced and sold the same amount of units. The only difference is the level of production we went through each year. Okay. All right, let's look at the cost data. Variable costs we're going to assume are $4 for direct materials, $21 for direct manufacturing labor, and this is $4 per unit, $21 per unit. Manufacturing overhead is $24 per unit, and selling and admin, $2 per unit. Those are all the variable costs, so it's perfectly reasonable to quote them in terms of per unit data. Fixed costs, our fixed manufacturing overhead are $54,000. Selling and admin is $30,000. And we have a sales price of $71 per unit. So before we look at the income statement, I want to walk through calculating the per unit data under both methods. Let's look at absorption costing first, because that's what we're used to. In year one, your per unit data, the cost of each unit, will consist, of course, of the variable costs, direct materials, direct labor, variable manufacturing overhead, for a grand total of $49. That's the 4 plus the 21 plus the 24. Notice I excluded the $2 selling and admin because that's a variable cost, but it's still a period cost. It is not a product cost. Now, here's where absorption costing gets a little tricky on the fixed costs, because the fixed manufacturing overhead is a lump sum irrespective of the number of units that are produced, albeit within the relevant range, remember. And for our purposes here, we're going to assume that we're staying within the relevant range. But in order to assign or allocate that fixed overhead to the unit, we're going to have to create a per unit cost. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the 54,000 in fixed overhead costs, and we will divide it by the production of 10,000 units, and that gives us $5.40 per unit. Makes sense. That leaves us with a grand total per unit of $54.40. Okay, seems pretty straightforward. Let's go to year 2. Variable cost still the same, $4, $21, $24, a grand total of $49. Now, here's one of the tricky pieces of absorption costing. We've got those $54,000 in fixed manufacturing overhead. We divide them by our production, but our production went up this year. We produced 12,000 units, which means our per unit cost is going down. Fixed manufacturing overhead on a per unit basis will only be $4.50. So what's happened? The per unit cost of our product has decreased, not because we've incurred less in costs, but because we're taking those fixed costs and spreading them over more units. And so we wind up with a per unit cost in year 2 of only $53.50. This is one of the criticisms of absorption costing and one of the pros to using variable costing and treating fixed overhead costs as if they're a period cost. Now, year 3 for 21-24, again, variable cost per unit, not an issue. Fixed manufacturing overhead, we take the $54,000, and in year 3, what happened? Our production decreased. We only produced 8,000 units, and so what do we have? We have a per unit cost of $6.75 for fixed overhead, increasing our overall per unit cost of $55.75. Year 3, units are costing more, not because we incurred more in costs, but because we're spreading those fixed overhead over fewer units. Okay. Now, variable costing per unit data is very straightforward because, again, we're not allocating the fixed overhead to the data. So for every year, our per unit cost is consistent because it includes only those true variable costs. And so we have a per unit cost for each year of $49. As such, any change in cost would only be if the costs themselves change. Now, I did not mention this before, but for simplicity's sake, we are assuming that no changes in costs occur from one year to the next. In other words, all costs are consistent over the 3-year period. Maybe not particularly realistic, but it will reduce the parameters that affect our differences. Okay, let's go over to the second worksheet and look at the income statements. Let's first look at absorption costing. Year 1, we have sales of $710,000. All I did there was I pulled these data from the other worksheet. I took the $71 sales price times the 10,000 units that we sold. Okay. Cost of goods sold in year 1, I simply took the 10,000 units we sold times the $54.40 that we calculated for year 1. Gross margin is just the difference between sales and cost of goods sold. Selling expenses, the period expenses, are the $2 per unit for variable times the 10,000 units sold plus the 30,000 in fixed costs, or $50,000. And that leaves us with net operating income of $116,000. Okay. Now, notice the format of the income statement for absorption costing is always that traditional gross margin format. Sales, cost of goods sold, gross margin, because we're not distinguishing between variable and fixed here. In fact, we are deliberately turning our fixed costs into a variable cost. Now let's look at year one variable costing. Sales are the same. That's not affected at all. Variable expenses. Now notice, first of all, we're switching our format because the variable costing income statement is strictly focused on identifying the difference between variable and fixed costs. We're actually going to use the contribution margin format for a variable costing income statement. So we have our variable expenses, variable cost of goods sold, which is just the 10,000 units we sold at the $49 per unit variable cost. A variable selling expense, 20,000, which is the 10,000 units at the $2 per unit selling and admin cost. That gives us a total variable expenses of $510,000. We subtract that from the $710 in sales, and we have a contribution margin of $200,000. From that, we will subtract all of our fixed expenses, the fixed overhead of $54,000, the fixed selling and admin of $30,000, a grand total of $84,000. That will yield net operating income of $116,000. A difference between the two methods, absorption and variable costing, of 0. Now remember, we talked about this in the other video. There was no change in inventory. No change in inventory will indeed yield the same income for both types of costing. All right, let's look at year two. Back up to absorption costing. Sales are the same. Keep in mind, we sold 10,000 units every year. Sales aren't going to change. Cost of goods sold, however, has changed. And that's strictly because we spread those fixed costs over more production, which means the cost per unit has gone down. It's now 53.5. And so we have a cost of goods sold of $535,000. We subtract that from $175,000, or from $710 the sales, to give us gross margin of $175. Selling and admin haven't changed. They won't change in this scenario from one year to the next because sales haven't changed. That leaves us with net operating income of $125,000. Now let's look at variable costing. Sales are $710. Notice, our variable expenses are exactly the same as year one. That's because our sales did not change from year one to year two. So we have variable expenses of $510, leaving us with a contribution margin of $200,000. We subtract our fixed expenses, which again have not changed. Our income is exactly the same as it was last year, $116,000. We sold the same. The basic costs did not change, therefore our income did not change. Remembering that our income in absorption costing changed because we did not sell everything, and some of those fixed overhead remain on the balance sheet in inventory. Now let's walk through, we can prove that. If you look, the difference between absorption costing and variable costing is $9,000, 125 minus 116. Let's think about it. How many units are sitting in ending inventory? Year two, ending inventory has 2,000 units, correct? So, let me just do this. We've got 2,000 units. For each of those units, we allocated to it $4.50 in fixed overhead. That means for each of those units, there's $4.50 in fixed overhead that's actually sitting on the balance sheet, not in income. 2,000 units at $4.50 per unit just happens to be $9,000. And that is the difference between absorption costing and variable costing, because we deferred it in ending inventory under absorption costing, but remember, we expensed the whole fixed overhead under variable costing. Okay. All right, let's look at year 3, and then we'll wrap this up. Sales remain the same. Notice cost of goods sold have changed again. Changed because we had the higher cost of goods sold per unit number because we had less production and therefore had to spread the costs, the fixed costs that is, over more units. So we have, over fewer units. So we have $553,000 in cost of goods sold. We subtract that from $710,000. That gives us a gross margin of $157,000. Subtract our selling and admin expenses, which haven't changed because our sales haven't changed, and that leaves us with $107,000 in net operating income. Variable costing, guess what? It's the same as year 1 and 2. We sold the same number of units. Variable costs were expensed through cost of goods sold per unit. Fixed expenses were expensed in their entirety. We come down to $116,000 in net operating income, and look what's happened. Now variable costing is higher than absorption costing, but by the same amount. And that's basically because, in this example at least, those 2,000 units that were sitting on the balance sheet at the end of year 2 ended up being sold in year 3, and so the expense related to them, this $4.50 in fixed overhead, got expensed under absorption costing in year 3. Now, one comment here, and then we're going to do a little bit of a reconciliation. Notice that for the 3-year period under both scenarios, cumulative income is exactly the same. The issue is, how is it effectively allocated between each year? And this is one of the cruxes of the differences, because it can, if a company is having a poor year, it could actually allow them under absorption costing to manipulate income for that year. And that's one of the concerns with absorption costing. Now let's look at this reconciliation, because we can prove again how it is strictly the fixed overhead and ending inventory that is the issue. So year 1, absorption costing income was $116,000. There was no fixed overhead deferred in ending inventory. There was no fixed overhead released from ending inventory. Again, inventory didn't change from beginning to end, leaving us with the same amount of variable costing income. Year 2, we have absorption costing of $125,000. Then we had those 2,000 units that were in $450 and fixed overhead was deferred. So that fixed overhead of $9,000 was deferred in ending inventory, meaning it wasn't expensed, it remained on the balance sheet. Nothing was released from ending inventory, and so that gets us down to what variable costing income would be. And we can see the only difference between the two is that $9,000 was deferred under absorption costing. Year 3, absorption costing income was $107,000. Nothing was deferred, but that $9,000 from the previous year was released. And that leaves us with variable costing income of $116,000. In other words, now, because that deferred overhead from the previous year was actually released, in other words, expensed, we now have reduced income under absorption costing and higher income under variable costing.